Today on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation about art, criticism, literature, philosophy, and a certain Belgian boy reporter with Tom McCarthy, novelist, artist, and author of Tintin and the Secret of Literature. Tom McCarthy is a novelist and artist, and now with the publication of Tintin and the Secret of Literature, newly released in America, a full-fledged literary critic. Tom, welcome to the program.
Nice to be here.
I guess the obvious question to ask first is, what made Tintin a subject for, I don't know if I want to say deconstruction, that's probably not the exact technical term I'm looking for, but what put your literary criticism focus on Tintin, of all things?
It's really simple. I've just really loved Tintin ever since I was a child, whereas I guess most children's books that I read as a child kind of fell away as I got more into serious literature. Tintin never really did, and when I started reading Shakespeare or Conrad as a teenager, I started recognizing the storylines and situations because I'd already encountered them in the Tintin books. They have very, very classical narrative structures. And then I started reading, the writers like Derrida, critics associated with the term deconstruction you just used. Again, lots of the themes and preoccupations that were coming up there, again, I kind of recognized from Tintin. So I always really wanted to write a book about Tintin viewed from a literary perspective. And the opportunity came up a few years ago, so I jumped at it.
I'm very familiar with Tintin myself. He's not quite as big in America as he is in a lot of other countries, but I've read all the adventures. I read them when I was a kid. I've read them again more recently. But I have never been a literary academic, so I'm not sure what are the challenges of taking the work of, say, Derrida, that method he has, and bringing it to Tintin.
Well, I'm not a literary academic either. I'm a novelist, but I read a lot of Derrida and like Lacan and Paul de Man, and I don't know. I find their work, especially in the case of Derrida, extremely creative, extremely playful. It's sometimes less critical than novelistic. He uses fictional personae. He uses kind of very rich metaphors, and it just seemed to lend itself really, really well to approaching Hergé, who, after all, comes from a same 20th century French tradition as people like Derrida, and is growing up on the same books. In this tradition of kind of Balzac and Proust.
Considering you're not a literary academic, and I'm not either, and most of the people listening to this program will not be literary academics. In fact, I don't think they're going to be familiar with Derrida or any of the critics you reference in the book. So you're probably going to be the perfect person then to explain what these critics do. What is their actual endeavor? What's the appeal of the project that they were all involved in?
It's difficult to summarize in a line or even 100 lines. Derrida, for example, is coming out of a tradition that really starts with Heidegger, of looking at conducting philosophy from the point of view of literature. So rather than seeing philosophy as this pure kind of rational field of logic or of absolute truth, really looking at how it's riven with poetic devices, with fictions and with intuitive and metaphorical kind of propositions. Another philosopher that looms large in Derrida's thinking is Nietzsche, for whom all truth is a kind of, he describes it as being like an army of metaphors and metonymies. Kind of truth is just fiction that's forgotten that it's fiction, So for someone like Derrida, the idea of writing is very important. He looks at the kind of the role that the notion of marks and traces play in philosophy, and also the role of, there are certain themes he keeps coming back to, like the artificial versus the real, and how actually we should be very, very suspicious of this distinction, and the real is often more artificial. What we take to be the real is often more artificial than what we think to be the artificial. And coming back to Hergé, this is something absolutely central to his work. The Tintin books so often revolve around fake money, fake art, forgery, criminal forgery gangs. and then embedded within them is a whole very complex family history inside the books and outside it, in Hergé's own family, of not actually being who you think you naturally are.
Tell me about the one critical book you focus very heavily on. Of course, that would be S.Z.
S.C. by Roland Barthes. Yes, this is a magnificent book, and if any of your listeners want a very exciting and exhilarating introduction to the kind of late 20th century French thought, there's no better place to start than Roland Barthes' S.C. It's a kind of long critical analysis of a novella by Balzac called Sarrasine, which revolves around a castrato opera singer who the hero disastrously assumes is a woman and makes a sculpture of, but then it turns out to be a man, or rather a castrated man, a castrato singer. And for Roland Barthes, analysing this story, this novella for him is exemplary of what literature is. It's this kind of something that seems to be full, seems to be natural, but is actually, when you look beneath, when you lift its skirt, as it were, it turns out to be empty, kind of riven with some kind of lack. And anybody that assumes, like the hero of Balzac's novella does, that the artist can simply copy nature, is going to come a cropper.
How did it become so applicable in your mind to Tintin, this specific book?
On a superficial level, there were just so many points that were, which plots in the plot situations in the Tintin books mirrored the plot of Balzac's book. I mean, there is an opera singer who keeps coming back through the Tintin books, who is a very dubious sexual designation. I mean, she's meant to be a woman, but she's really masculine. When Captain Haddock, one of the main characters, first sees her, the sequence that follows of him returning to the same opera box night after night is identical to the situation of the sculptor in Balzac's novella when he first sees Sarrasine sing. I mean, there are even lines of dialogue that you almost, I came to suspect, Hergé is deliberately taking from Balzac. So at that level, there seem to be lots of overlaps, but then at a more profound level, the thematics, the themes are absolutely the same. This concern with fakeness, with emptiness, and this very, quite horrifying and quite dark, almost catastrophic process of encountering art as a kind of emptiness and as a kind of absence.
You make it fairly clear, at least to my mind you do, in Tintin and the Secret of Literature, that your favorite Tintin book is the Castafiore Emerald, which is, of course, named after Bianca Castafiore, that opera singer we just spoke about. What makes that adventure, the one that comes a little bit late in the Tintin body of work, the one where, as everyone says, the one where nothing happens, what makes it so rich for analysis?
I think it's a piece of genius, because as you point out, nothing happens. And to pull off a book in which nothing happens and to make it really interesting is an astounding feat. At the same time, by having nothing happen, it's a huge smokescreen, and everything is going on in that book. Hergé's own autobiography is being written covertly and held up to public scrutiny while still remaining secret. I mean, we should point out Hergé's own father and uncle were twins and illegitimate children of a maid in an aristocratic chateau, very like Marlinspike, the one that Captain Haddock ends up inheriting. And the song that the opera diva Bianca Castafiore sings is from Gounod's Faust, which is a story of that the character that sings it has been banged up, impregnated by an aristocrat and given birth illegitimately to a child, which is a huge scandal, and which is exactly what happened in Hergé's own ancestry. And in the book, she keeps coming and singing this song, and then there's a breakdown. The lights go off, the electricity fails. So it's almost like this stuttering kind of confession that keeps, as soon as it gets brought to light, gets hidden again. And this plays out in so many different ways, even in the garden with the fertilization of flowers and the kind of encryption going on there. The rose is the Bianca rose, that one of them is trying to turn white instead of red, this kind of very sexual Blakean image of a kind of deflowered woman having her purity restituted through an artificial process, which is kind of what happened in Hergé's family after his grandmother was wedded to a gardener, to cover up her shame. And so there's just so much going on in that book that makes it incredibly tantalizing, and at the same time, kind of nothing happens at all.
You spend no small amount of text on the character of Castafiore herself, and I wanted to ask what you make of her, but I also wanted to point out to maybe those who have read some Tintin books in the audience, but haven't thought about them as closely as you have, that she is, I believe, the only woman to play a part in any of the Tintin books of that size, to be a major character. What do you make of that fact?
Yeah, it's a very masculine world. I mean, all of his allegiances and friendships are with men, and then suddenly this woman appears, and what a woman! She's so dominating and overbearing. I mean, one type of immediate kind of feminist reading could be, well, it's just very sexist and patriarchal, which is, there's certainly an element of truth in that, but I think it's actually more subtle because, I mean, if you look at Tintin himself, he's completely effeminate. I mean, he's kind of more female than male, really, typographically, and in the way he looks, and he shows no sign of ever having gone through puberty or anything like this. Castafiore is this fascinating kind of castrating. It's even implied by her name, Castafiore, and with her comes this whole kind of history of sexual trauma that's implicit not just in Hergé's family but also in the family history of Captain Haddock, who's also posited as kind of illegitimate. A professor at Stanford has pointed this out. Actually, sorry, I got that wrong. It's not a professor at Stanford. A French psychoanalyst called Serge Tisserand has pointed out that Captain Haddock's character is himself posited, as his ancestor is posited by the text as a kind of illegitimate descendant of Louis XIV. That's why he's given the castle, because it's kind of shorthand for when a king in the 18th century gives someone a property, it's usually in lieu of recognition. So yeah, she's this kind of almost terrifying negative. As Freud would say, she's the symptom returning. She's the repressed returning.
As far as the character of Tintin himself, I wanted to get your take on what makes a character like Tintin appealing, because whenever anybody talks about him, they say, well, he's a character who's kind of a complete cipher. He's just sort of nothing. Anybody can put whatever they want onto him because he has very few characteristics. Do you consider him to be that? First of all, do you consider him to be a character with few characteristics?
Yes. I mean, Hergé described him as the degree zero of typage. I mean, he made his face a zero, a round hole with two little dots for eyes. I mean, there's no life in those eyes. They're just kind of points, So in one sense, he really is neutral and blank, and this space for projection. On the other hand, he does have attributes. He has a kind of moral code that Hergé got from the Boy Scouts that he was in as a child and teenager, and Tintin, in fact, started out as a kind of Boy Scout figure in a Boy Scout magazine. And, he takes a stand against injustice and so on. I mean, and those attributes continue even when the world gets more and more dark and more complex as the decades roll on, and becomes kind of amoral. Tintin becomes a moralist in an amoral world. and even, some of his closest friends betray him, and he starts out, as a kind of political agent of the right, actually, and going and defeating communism. But by the end, right and left are kind of meaningless. You see these shots towards the end of Tintin and the Picaros, where he's flying over Alcazaropolis, this imaginary South American capital, before and after a revolution. And in both instances, he flies over a slum where people are living in abject poverty, and the only thing that's changed after the revolution is the banner saying "Viva Alcazar" rather than "Viva Tapioca," the previous incumbent dictator. So there's this kind of strange, disjunction between a set of. I mean, in a way, you could say the Tintin books show the emptying out of a set of kind of moral or political principles. I mean, it's kind of dark stuff. They're rather depressing in many ways, or certainly very sad.
In stark contrast to the visuals of the books, which are generally very bright and appealing to look at. Now, I wanted to ask about one thing you mentioned in the book, actually mentioned a few times, how in Hergé's career early on, as you mentioned, he worked for a right-wing paper. He had Tintin go defeat communists. As you put it, he replaces politics with friendship in terms of ideology. How does he do that?
In the 30s, Tintin meets a young Chinese boy called Chang, and they become great friends, and Tintin realizes that they have this nice kind of liberal globalist discussion where they say, I thought all Chinese people were torturers, and Chang says, and I thought all white men were devils, and they realize it's just because we don't understand each other enough, and so on and so on. This is mirrored in Hergé's own life by his encounter with a young Chinese student also called Chang, which is where he took the name from, who came to him to help advise him on how to paint Shanghai and the Far East and how to kind of get it right. But they became very close friends. So this kind of ideology of friendship replaces an ideology of ideology. What's interesting is that as the books continue, both of these get voided. So politics becomes a sham, but so to a large extent does friendship, and lots of Tintin's own friends end up kind of betraying him or letting him down.
Does any part of the world remain solid ground for Tintin throughout the series?
No. By the end, by the last book, which is called Tintin and the Alphart, it was never completed, but it was published posthumously in kind of manuscript form. It revolves around an art forgery operation in which language itself is kind of, there's an art movement which makes giant letters as though the language itself becomes this kind of set of empty signs. And everything just becomes fake. It's almost like some kind of David Lynch film where you realize the world is not the world. and it's all just a simulacrum, and you go through the mirror. And in fact, the final sequence that Hergé died while he was writing, very fittingly, shows Tintin being led off by the art forger villains to be turned into a statue called Reporter by having concrete poured over him. So he's actually he's entering his own simulacrum. So he's becoming his own empty signifier, and at that point, the author himself dies. It's so perfect in a way, and so incredibly dark.
You find a lot of themes, you find patterns, you find a host of neat stuff through literary criticism in the Tintin books, in your book, Tintin and the Secret of Literature. How much does it matter whether or not all this stuff, these, say, parallels to Balzac, how much does it matter that this stuff was in or was not in Hergé's conscious mind when he made these adventures?
I think it matters not that much. It's interesting to know how conscious he was of the parallels that his work kind of evokes, and it's clear that as his career progressed, he became more and more self-conscious and more aware of the kind of literary precedents that his work is plugging into. But the thing is, an author doesn't invent the symbolic order. An author doesn't invent language. There are structures that I know this as a writer. There are structures that precede you. An author doesn't invent language any more than a surfer invents the wave. The ocean swell. They're riding a particular moment of it, but the swell is a much bigger process than them. Use a metaphor that I'm sure people in California with your wonderful waves will be able to appreciate.
There's a lot of surfers here, yes.
And writing and culture is kind of the same. When my novel came out, critics and others were saying, oh, he must have read this book and he must have read that book, and some of them I had, some of them I hadn't, and the ones I hadn't, when I went and read, I would go, oh yes, of course, this is kind of, not always, but often, there was a lot of similarity and overlap, and this was, if not a direct influence, at least connected or influenced something that I'd been influenced by. So, it's all connected. It's a giant switchboard, basically.
So you might say that when doing literary criticism, as you quote, or as you do in Tintin and the Secret of Literature, what you're doing is you're doing an analysis that analyzes the way an author uses tools. They're tools the author can't help using. So yes, it's going to be applicable whether or not they think they're doing something that can be analyzed in this way later. How often did the critics hit the mark when they would make claims about what you must have been thinking or must not have been thinking? How often was it literally true what they said?
Oh, that I had been thinking of such and such a book, you mean?
When they said he must have been thinking of this book that you actually hadn't read, what would you think when you, say, went to read that book after they thought that you'd already read it?
Well, in lots of instances, it made complete sense. For example, one of the critics said, okay, this passage is influenced by Kleist's writing on puppets. And I went and looked at this later, which I hadn't read. I went and looked at it later, and it was absolutely about the same concerns as I'd had about kind of artificiality and repetition. And, I hadn't read Kleist, but I'd read people that Kleist had read, and I'd read people that had read Kleist. And this is what I mean about the kind of switchboard theory. You might not be connected to point X, but you're kind of connected to point Y that's connected to point X, and that's feeding into the kind of line that you're on. So I mean, of course, some things are kind of wide of the mark, and I mean, it doesn't mean anything goes, and you can just say any old thing. I mean, I think part of the kind of challenge of thinking formally about literature is really, if we go back to our surfing analogy, you've got to really look at the way the ocean swell moves, and you've got to look at the way the individual surfer kind of carves his way or her way across the wave face, because there is a lot of it's about, it's about skill, it's about craft. I mean, I'm not of the school that believes you can just say any old crap and it's all valid, because that's just silly kind of relativism, really.
Since you are a novelist, I want to know what parallels you see between your work and Hergé's. That people will talk about your work and say, oh, well, there's, yes, themes of encryption, themes of repetition, as you just said, that sort of thing. How much overlap did you see thematically between your books and the Tintin books?
A lot, I think. I mean, in Remainder, there's in fact a whole sequence in which the hero who has created this artificial building around himself, who's paid someone to play the piano, to practice the piano again and again and make mistakes in the same place, he realizes that the pianist has substituted a tape or a CD, and that he can wander out and leave the set, as it were. That was a very conscious tribute to a particular sequence in the Cast of Fury Emerald where exactly that happens. But there's other ways in which the themes generally of artificiality, of repetition, of kind of trauma, they're in the Tintin books, they're in Remainder. I mean, they're also in a whole bunch of other books. I guess everything that you read kind of finds its way somehow into your work. I mean, I guess the trick is to become less and less conscious of it until it's just, kind of, I don't know, when a jazz player is playing their saxophone, I mean, hopefully they're not thinking at every point, oh, this has got to be like Parker, or this has got to be like Bird or whatever, but, it's just kind of, it's all in there, and it finds its own autonomous kind of configuration, and that's when you can do your own thing. Does that make sense?
Certainly does. Now, I wanted to ask about another part of your own perspective that is unusual. You describe in an interview, I believe it was with The Believer, saying that you had, correct me if I'm wrong on the ratio here, but 1 toe in the world of literature and 9 toes in the world of art? Was that what you said?
5 and 5, actually.
Okay.
I'm exaggerating.
Okay, well, we'll put it that way. But what advantage does that give you where you have some toes in art, some toes in literature, when you're either making fiction or whether you're examining and analyzing fiction? What does the art experience afford you?
Well, I guess it's the being able to look at your own practice from the outside. My background is really 100% literature. I mean, it's what I do, it's what I studied, it's what I kind of am passionate about first and foremost. But I mean, I really find, reading philosophy and involving yourself in contemporary art, which is so kind of conceptual anyhow, really does help you look back on fiction from the outside. It's always good to see something from the outside, or from the margins where, the really interesting place is the margins where things become kind of hybrid and merge into other things. So it's been a huge kind of advantage to me. And just in a practical sense, I mean, Remainder, nobody would publish Remainder when I wrote it. None of the conventional mainstream presses in the UK, and it was initially an art press that brought it out, an art press based in Paris, although they published it in English, and they distributed it, a very limited edition, around the art circuit. So you could buy it in art galleries and museums, but not in bookshops. And that, I mean, one of those editions found its way to the head of Vintage, Marty Asher, in New York, and he decided to do a mass market, more conventional edition, and which was great and fantastic. But that, I mean, I really owe the fact that he even got to read it to this art publisher, and so I was kind of, since then I've been a big cheerleader for art and the art world as being more adventurous and more willing to take risks than perhaps the mainstream publishing world, at least in the UK.
With the type of books you write, do you find major differences between publishing them in the US and the UK in terms of the reception they get and who's willing to bring them out?
I think readers in America are different from in the UK. In America, it seems to me, people either read the really dumb stuff, the kind of Da Vinci Code, Harry Potter, whatever, or they go straight up to the Updikes and the Pynchons and the, the much more demanding literary writers. Whereas in the UK, the vast majority of readers want to be in between, in this kind of comfort zone of middlebrow, which is neither too dumb nor too demanding. It's always going to give you something to think about, but not too much, not challenge you too much. And I think, there's a kind of stodginess inherent in that British model that makes it difficult for a novel like Remainder to be published. And in the US, it just seems there is much more space for kind of adventurous writing. I mean, since Remainder came out, I've been having books sent to me from the US soliciting a blurb for the front or back cover or whatever, and I'm always really pleasantly surprised to see how adventurous these books are. I'm getting sent really weird books by 28-year-old first-time writers that would just never get published here, let alone by the type of people, the Vintages and the, Knopf and so on that are doing them in America. So I think, I'm very pro-American from a publishing point of view, at least.
Tell us a little bit about the novel you have in the works right now.
Its provisional title is C, and the letter C, and it's really about mourning with a U, and kind of there's another Tintin parallel here about family secrets and the way these get transmitted down generations. So it's set in the early 20th century where new technologies such as radio are emerging, and in the family I've got one of the siblings dies, and so it's almost as though the technology itself becomes the site of the crypt in which they're mourned. After that comes out, there's another novel I've got out here called Men in Space, but I think Vintage are going to bring that out in America after the new one. They're reversing the order. Marty was explaining to me when they got Murakami, he'd written 5 books, and so they had the luxury of saying, okay, we're going to do number 3 first because that's the most commercial, and then we're going to do number 2 because that's the most demanding, and then we're going to do number 4 because that'll come nicely after that. Do you know what I mean? There's a kind of, I think they have a long-term view. When it's another great thing about, it was really, like Marty Asher really was like the kind of fairy godmother I've been waiting for all this time, because he's, he made it clear, kind of, we'll let you develop, we'll let you do what you want. Which again, I think it takes, a level of bravery and commitment to do, and that's kind of often lacking in the UK, where people, if they get a nice book deal, it might drop in, the publisher might go cold on them 2 years later if it doesn't sell so much. I think it's important as a writer to know that you can kind of do what you need to do and not always have to be going for kind of, bestseller kind of payola. Because, look at the great books like, I don't know, Moby Dick sold 50 copies in its first year, and that Kafka's collected stories sold 11 copies in its first year, and he bought 10 of them himself, and he got paranoid about who the 11th was.
Do you foresee the aggressively middlebrow publishing situation in the UK changing, or do you think about ways to change it all day long? I'm curious.
Well, I'm very interested in this model of the art press publishing, more literary fiction than the supposedly literary presses. It's not just Metronome Press that first published me that have done this. There are other examples, like the art press Bookworks have just brought out a series of experimental novels in the vein of William Burroughs and people like that. And Sternberg Press in New York, again an art press, they published a really good novel by Jennifer Higgy, who's one of the editors of Frieze magazine, again a kind of art world person that I presume she couldn't get published in the more mainstream world. So I think this is an interesting, the way that art is kind of picking up the tab where publishing has fallen short. So it is something that I do think about it a lot. I don't know if I can proactively, if I had several £1 million, maybe I could found my own press. But it seems to me I've become very interested in the publication histories of all my heroes, and they usually, apart from Updike, who was just straight in with the big publishers, aged 23 or something, he's the exception. Most people, Joyce couldn't get his work published. Faulkner had enormous difficulties. Burroughs was first published by a Parisian pornographer, Maurice Girodias, in limited editions. And I think, it's very common that what becomes the kind of literary classics has a very slow gestation and has to kind of find its way into print through left field kind of marginal operations. That's not to say, of course, that everything that's not published is automatically great, or that everything that has problems getting published is great, because a lot of that's no good as well.
Now, we're nearly out of time, but I wanted to wind my way back to the Tintin book and ask you this about the very title itself, Tintin and the Secret of Literature. Why is it a secret?
The title's quite playful, and the whole book's quite playful. I mean, something that maybe hasn't really come across in what we've been talking about so far is just how funny the Tintin books are. I mean, they're incredibly funny, and I had a lot of fun writing this book. And, I mean, even some people have read it as a spoof, which it's not, but it's definitely playful. I mean, it seems like quite a silly idea. I mean, the way it came about was the publisher said to me, would you like to write a book on Derrida or Freud? And I said, no, I want to write a book on Tintin, because then I could write about Derrida and Freud and a whole bunch of other stuff, and it would be much more fun. And they kind of went for it, to my surprise. So I mean, the title itself is almost like a spoof on one of the Tintin books, Tintin, the Secret of the Unicorn, Tintin and the Secret of Red Rackham's Treasure, and so on. But, I mean, I guess more accurately, what I'm trying to outline in my book is not a secret per se, but a kind of structure of secrecy that structures lots of literature, certainly the Tintin books, but also, you could say the same thing about the work of Nabokov or of Joy or of Faulkner in particular. There's always almost always a kind of family crypt at the center of it. This kind of mausoleum, which is like a pyramid full of encryptions and false alleyways and trapdoors. And when you enter it, what's the point of it is not to come out with a kind of nugget of resolved meaning, but really to appreciate this whole kind of endless structure of secrecy. And every time you think you found the inner chamber, it's just a dummy chamber that's actually the inner chamber is somewhere else or in some other pyramid entirely. And that's really what I was trying to kind of get at in this book.
Having written the book, having paid very close attention to the entire Tintin collection, having, I assume, read a lot of secondary material on Tintin, can you still go back to those original books, the original Tintin adventures, and still find new things, or is the well dry for you at this point?
No, not at all. I mean, this is the thing, say you're a kid and you like watching motor cars go by, and there's this childlike pleasure in seeing the speed and the color, and then you grow up and you get into, car racing, and you learn all about engines and different types of oil and aerodynamic structures, and you become a professional, car engineer or something on a racetrack. I mean, you don't lose any of the instinctive pleasure that you had as a child. If anything, it's augmented. It just becomes richer and more complex. And this is, to come back to deconstruction and writers like Derrida, this is what I love reading about. I love about reading their work is there's just so much pleasure taken in the possibilities of literature, and the more that it's analyzed, the more pleasurable it becomes. In a way, the more kind of unnaive it becomes, the more naive it becomes in the sense of immediate kind of pleasure. So this is really what happened to me with the Tintin books, writing this book. I can read them now with even more pleasure than I could before I started reading all the secondary material. And I think good thinking about literature should produce that. It should remake it anew in all its simplicity as well as its complexity.
Well, Tom McCarthy, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the program.
Not at all. Real pleasure.
Our music is composed by Ben Althouse. Check out his website, Ben Althouse, that's BenAlthouse.com. For more information and our online show archive, visit ColinMarshallRadio.com.